All right, thank you, presenters. We do have just a minute left, but just wanted to let you know that I've just started the live stream, so whenever you're ready, you can start. Thank you.
I'm ready when you are, Cara.
Ready. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our session. Kelly Meyer and I are going to be talking about implementing a trauma-informed school. So we'll just kind of start off with some introductions. Kelly?
Yes, hi everyone, and welcome. My name is Kelly Meyer. I am a school psychologist with Northeast Metro 916. I currently work in the secondary school, so 7th through 21-year-olds, 7th grade through 21-year-old students. And I also have experience working with elementary students, specifically nonverbal ASD and DCD students. The last 2 years I have spent working as an MTSS coordinator for 916, so focused on PBIS and RTI and systems work.
I'm Cara Micklin. I'm the lead school social worker for Northeast Metro 916. I lead a team of 20 school social workers throughout our district in all of our federal setting for special education programs. In addition, I'm also a member of our district consultation team, which works with our member district setting 3 special education programs to provide student-specific needs and figure out best ways to meet them and keep them in a less restrictive setting. In addition, providing training throughout the metro area as part of that consultation team. So I'm really excited to be joining you today. I am joining you live from Kansas. If you hear any squeaks or squawks in the background, that is just my 1.5-year-old nephew. I've taken over his bedroom in order to present, so just a heads up, it's good. If you hear it, we'll move on. We did want to invite anyone who would like to just to unmute and introduce yourself, just name and what your role is and what district. We were just kind of curious who is in the audience today.
Hi, I'm Carlos Seguenza. I am a K-4 music teacher in the West St. Paul district at Garlow Environmental Magnet School.
Hi, I'm Carol Procopio, and I'm a 7 through 12 math teacher at Northland.
I'm Matt Lambert. I'm a 5th and 6th grade setting 3 teacher in Austin, Minnesota.
Jamie Kirchner. I teach 7th grade science and am the PBIS coach at Oltman Middle School.
Britt Johnson. I teach 4th grade reading and writing at Prairie Seeds Academy, and I'm also the SST chair.
I'm LaSure Henderson, K-5 counselor, and I'm also on the PBIS team.
I'm Michelle Rinke Cook from Monaga. I teach 2nd grade, and I am the internal co-coach for our elementary school.
Good morning, I'm Mark French, principal at Gatewood Elementary in the Hopkins School District.
Hi, I'm Rachel Moog. I am a 2nd grade teacher going into 3rd grade teacher next year at Prairie Seeds Academy. I'm also the PBIS coach at my school.
I'm Katie Hopfer. I teach kindergarten at Waseca at Hartley Elementary.
Good morning. My name is David Stroud. I am a math teacher, 6th grade through geometry at a charter school called Southside Family School in Minneapolis.
I'm Janet Ha. I'm a special ed high school case manager at Lionsgate Academy, a charter school for kids with autism.
I'm Diana Irving, and I work at the German Immersion School as a artist behavior interventionist.
Perfect. Thank you all that were willing to share. We really appreciate it. And that's wonderful. It sounds like we have a really good mix of educators and related service education staff, as well as some administrators here. So we are very hopeful that this will meet your needs. Certainly do ask questions as they come up. For my part, I will not be able to read the chat, but if you do chat in a question, Kelly Meyer will read that aloud if it goes to her or me, or if you want both of us to speak on that, and we'll address it that way. Our learning targets for today, you're all educators, I will let you read them. Just a few things to highlight. We are really hoping that you will understand after this presentation how trauma-informed care and practices really align with PBIS practices. PBIS is really another vehicle for trauma-informed care. We're also going to talk about what we did at Northeast Metro 916 as we're kind of continuing on this journey towards being trauma-informed. And then thinking about ways to implement systems in your classroom and building and in your district. So those systems level pieces, and also really spending some time talking about what we need to be thinking about moving into next school year, given the pandemic of COVID-19 and then the murder of George Floyd and the racialized trauma that our students are dealing with. So with that, we will get started. So brief overview of our district, just to give you a sense of where we are and what we do. We are one of 4 intermediate districts in the state, and we provide specifically defined services to students that are a part of our member districts. I always kind of thought of it as like a co-op. So smaller districts, buy into our district, and in that we provide the highest level of special education need. So we serve in those 4 intermediate districts around 45 member districts in total. And then in our district, we have about 5,000 students. This says 6, but it's around 5 right now, just with summer enrollment and things bouncing around. Being predominantly a setting for school, everything is very specialized. At our younger programs and sites, we have a pre-K program, 2 elementary sites, later elementary site, and then a secondary school site. And then on top of that, we have 2 specialized 18 to 21 programs. In that, we don't typically, I'm trying to think of the most politically correct way to say this. We don't pull kids apart based on their educational diagnosis alone. What we're really looking to do is figure out ways to get kids to have the best school experience they can, regardless of what that disability category is. So oftentimes, especially at the secondary level, students, regardless of their needs label, will be in classes that are designed to meet the academic standard versus necessarily just looking at, oh, no, this is only EBD history. So we have found that in doing that, it gives kids an opportunity to really achieve in academics, and it also normalizes the school experience, given that they're at more of a unique setting. Kelly, anything else you want to add on about the district here?
No, I think you did a great job, Cara.
Oh, thanks. Okay. So moving on. I don't know what I hit here. Sorry about that. Okay, so trauma-informed care, like many of the systems we think of in schools to make it better for kids, when we think about equity programs, when we think about restorative justice, when we think about PBIS, those are initiatives that take time. And they're worth the time and investment, and we'll show you some data related to that. But we wanted to give everyone here just a really realistic sense of where our time has been, because we're in 2020, but really this work started in 2011. 2011, our district implemented PBIS for the first time. In 2015, some of our school sites, so this was not a district initiative, this was led by the school social workers and school psychologists, we came together and said, you know, we're reading a lot about this trauma-informed school stuff, like we need to get on board, and how do we do it? Well, we started off by taking the ACEs study, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. We rolled out trauma-informed practices at the high school and the elementary sites, and that looked like doing push-in sessions into classrooms. So we used a universal curriculum that we built as school social workers from various SEL curriculums and based on our own clinical practice. And we taught kids about trauma and what anxiety is and what toxic stress is, and we had those conversations. From push-in sessions, we would also do small groups or a one-on-one, depending upon what that child's needs were. Our district also began work with an outside consultant. So in 2016, we hired Pete Singer from Clearwater Consulting. And Pete's work is mostly looking at the grown-ups in the system. Your educators, this is for our admin here, your educators cannot be trauma informed if they themselves are not regulated. So if they're experiencing a ton of toxic stress and trauma, they are unable to access their skills in order to teach to the best of their abilities. So just, we need to be thoughtful. It's a both and. It's not, oh, we can just do this to the kids, we can fix them. We have to really be doing the work to ourselves as well, and making sure that we are taking care of ourselves deeply and authentically in order to make sure that this work is meaningful, and again, that we can access our scalability to be the best trauma-informed educators we can. In 2018, we did the Philadelphia ACEs. So just to give you a little background on this, if you're not familiar, the traditional ACEs study was done in California in the 90s. It was out of Kaiser Permanente, which is an insurance company. And what they were doing was looking for how hard things in life or adverse experiences correlate to later health outcomes. Really good idea, right? There are some flaws though. So this was normed on middle class, typically college educated, predominantly white folks. So the city of Philadelphia was looking at the data and saying, well, that's great, but this really is not an inclusive narrative. Like, we need to think about all these other experiences of racism and bullying, and what does it look like if you don't have a college-based education? What does it look like if you're food insecure? Those are adverse experiences too. So in 2015, the city of Philadelphia published a more broad look at adverse experiences that was much more inclusive and comprehensive. And they call that the Philadelphia ACEs. So when our school social workers and school psychologists learned about this, we were like, it's enough for us just to do the ACEs study, knowing that that's not representative of our student population. So we came back and in 2018 did the more comprehensive Philadelphia ACEs study. I've been asked before, you know, how did you do the ACEs at school? What does that look like? So what we had done in order to do these studies was we had every student meet one-on-one with a safe staff. That staff was who they identified. Most of the time it was their school social workers or school psychologists. I know there's some school counselors in there. You guys are awesome too, but we just don't use school counselors as a discipline in our district. Certainly this would be a school counselor realm. Education assistants, if they have the training on doing this and they feel comfortable and have that connection. Teaching staff, it really, again, can be anyone that the child identifies as their safe, connected person. And we had it go question by question. The original study is a 10 question survey. The Philadelphia study is 15. We loaded it on Google. We put it in on our teacher accounts. So we sat with them. So it was completely anonymous. We sent home letters alerting parents that we would do it, and that if they didn't want us to, that, you know, they certainly could opt out, and that we were going to keep it anonymous, and that it was just to inform our practice. I think of the 45 students I had in the high school at the time we did the Philadelphia ACEs, I had 3 families opt out. We also that year started thinking about in 2018 doing restorative practices. And we had these listening sessions happening at the same time. So when Pete Singer started his work, what we found was a lot of our staff just wanted to talk about how hard their work is in a sped setting, and about what they're dealing with and having to bring to work, just those hard pieces of normal life, and then sometimes being at the risk of being exposed to violence at work. So listening sessions were happening, and Shania Walker, our LICSW and restorative practices lead, began again using restorative practices as a vehicle for that trauma-informed care as well, because we were looking for ways that we were not re-traumatizing kids. And when we think about in systems, most of the behavioral tools we use that are exclusionary are not trauma informed. They're re-traumatizing. Anytime we tell a kid to get out of class or get out of school or you don't belong here, typically we are re-traumatizing them depending upon their background and history. So for us, that was no longer acceptable, and we had to come up with a better way. And for us, restorative practices was the way we chose to spend our energy. And it's been highly successful. The past school year, we've had a ton of data gains at our high school program for, again, special education setting 4. 93% of the time, students were in class this whole school year. That's huge. I think most typical high schools probably couldn't tout that sort of inclusion rate into school. Our suspensions were way, way, way down. We had 5 suspensions at the high school all year. So it's been very successful. All of our new staff now receive a Trauma 101. It's a full day. I co-facilitate with a couple of extra people, typically our mental health specialist in the district, Kevin Horst, and we spend 8 hours teaching people about the basics of trauma, attachment, what are those trauma-informed practice skills, and how do we then as grown-ups take care of ourselves when we're experiencing vicarious or secondary traumatic stress. We also have 2 cohorts specifically related to this, the restorative cohort. So we are getting all of our administrators, our school social workers and school psychs trained in restorative practices, and that's been an ongoing process. So we're in the 2nd year of the cohort right now. So more folks every summer are going through that, and that's hosted by MDE. We also have the trauma cohort. And what that is it's looking at who are those people in the school system that are naturally placed across disciplines that can also provide some of that debriefing and coaching to staff as needed. So just that ongoing support. So we're building capacity in our people. So eventually when Pete Singer and his group phases out, we have all of the skills so that any one of our staff, ideally, can jump in when either a scholar or a staff are experiencing a traumatic episode and support them through that. And consequently, the pieces that follow afterwards, because trauma often is not a single episode.
Kara, quick question in the chat. Are you able to share those push-in sessions and that curriculum that the 916 team developed?
I will have to check. If you send me an email, my email's at the end, just email me. And as long as that's cool with our district, I'm happy to share. I could even maybe just share parts of it as opposed to the whole thing, or maybe just the general scope and sequence. But yes, please do email me. Our contact info is at the end. Any other questions?
That's it.
Cool. Sorry, I just can't see both screens. Thank you. So this is just an example, or this is our ACEs study. We thought people might be interested to see. The very far right-hand side, you will see these are the numbers from the original ACEs study. So the Kaiser Permanente study that were done. They're in kind of that brownish color. Most of the population that was studied has 1 or less ACEs. You will see with our student population, a great deal more have 4 or more ACEs. Now, as I said, the study is about 10 questions long, but 4 is a really important number in the ACEs study because 4 is the threshold for which, when you're getting to that place, we can pretty much assume there will be some problematic outcomes for you in your health and mental health later. You're on a really negative trajectory for your later health. So just because they have it doesn't mean we can't work with it and heal. And the best part about trauma, and I'm such a social worker because I always try to make it positive, but it's true. The best part about trauma is it heals in the context of relationships. So just because you have kids in your class where 61% of them have 4 or more ACEs doesn't mean, well, gosh, we're going to just sit back and admire the problem. And that happens a lot with trauma measures. We see that there's a need. And then because we care so much about kids, that's why we work in schools, we get stuck there. So this is an invitation today to be aware of the information. If this is happening in our program, it's likely happening in yours, and not get stuck. If we just admire the problem, that's not an intervention. So why are schools addressing trauma? Like I just said, we have it. It's very prevalent. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it is as we move into the why and the how. So trauma overwhelms a person's ability to cope. It's really important to remember that it is subjective in some ways. There's really 3 ingredients. There's an event, an experience, and an effect. And that's from SAMHSA, if anyone wants to read about this later. So people can have a similar event. So let's say Kelly and I are walking down the street and both experience watching a car accident. So we have the same event. Following that, though, Kelly had the experience of going home and talking to her family about it. And they were really supportive and understanding and empathic. And even though she had really big feelings about it, she was able to process them. Possibly she had some past experience processing hard things. That's resilience. We'll talk about that too. So afterward, her effect was she moved on. It might have taken a few days, but she was able to sleep, eat, kind of get back to her normal state of functioning. Maybe for me, the event was the awful car accident. I watched it with Kelly. We went our separate ways, and I had no one. So I had to sit with it. Maybe I had some past experience of trauma, and I haven't ever had an experience to have mastery. So I'm not totally healed. It's triggering some past things. Maybe I'm spiraling and my anxiety is going up. And there's no one there to support me. And then I can't sleep and I'm having nightmares and I'm having intrusive thoughts. And in 6 months, I might be having an onset of a diagnosis that looks like post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's my effect. So when we think about trauma, it's overwhelming a singular person's ability to cope. It's very subjective. It has those 3 ingredients, and it results in that feeling of helplessness and powerlessness. And it impacts our functioning to the point where we no longer feel like we have a sense of connection or control or meaning. We feel stuck. It's this paralysis. Does that sound similar to maybe that sense of paralysis anyone's feeling right now with COVID-19? I know I've had a few days like that. So I say that because as we continue to be thinking about these concepts, it's really important that we're thinking about as we're coming into the next school year, it's going to be much more apparent to us that our kids and our staff and ourselves are walking around with a lot of trauma. The ACEs, I've already spent some time on, so I'll just go ahead and move forward. So this is just hopefully a brief review. And if after this you have some more questions or want to spend some more time getting really in depth with any of these pieces, again, please do email Kelly or myself. We have a ton of resources and great books that we can recommend. But just briefly, when we think about trauma in the mental health community, we think about acute trauma, which is also sometimes named single incident trauma or contextual trauma. So if all of us were in a room and I had a list, which is preferable to when we do this presentation, but a list of some events, right? A car accident, losing a family member, witnessing war. We would all say, oh yeah, those are traumas. And they're single incident, right? If you witness war for like a day. So it's one time, it's really short-lived. When we think about chronic trauma or non-contextual trauma, and when I speak about contextual and non-contextual, that comes from the work of Resmaa Menakem. He wrote the book My Grandmother's Hands and has an online 5-module training on racialized body trauma that is amazing. It's a reference I add later, but especially when we get to talking about racialized violence and the murder of George Floyd and what's happening in our country right now, chronic trauma really is what we're dealing with. This is something that has been experienced over a long period of time. We have been stuck in a pandemic for 3 months. People are dealing with 400 years of racialized violence and oppression. Those are those big umbrellas that we're working under right now. In more typical interactions with students, we often hear it in the narratives of chronic abuse and neglect, ongoing community violence. This also plays into when we think about historical and intergenerational trauma. Again, that collective oppression over time is both chronic and historical. So you can pull things in multiple contexts. When we think about intergenerational and historic trauma, also thinking about violent colonization, when we think about the barbaric practices that occurred in Indian boarding schools, chattel slavery in America and the continued oppression, assimilation policies, segregation, racism, discrimination. These are all things that we're dealing with right now and communities have been dealing with for a very long time. It's tricky though. So from a clinical perspective, when we're thinking about acute and oftentimes chronic trauma, especially in our white bodies, we're able to visualize and understand the context or the event, right? So, oh, you're telling me about this bad thing that happened to you. Even in my power and privilege, I don't have to work really hard to understand that that was hard. Oftentimes when we're thinking about historical and intergenerational trauma, the event is far removed. So it's harder to conceptualize anyway. And then when we're walking around in white bodies with power and privilege and we haven't had those experiences and narratives, it is impossible to empathize in an authentic way. Now, that does not mean you cannot be an ally and be a supportive person and loving and caring. It just means that it's going to look and feel different. And you got to do a lot of personal work too to get to that really authentic, genuine place. Because if you can't be genuine and authentic and lean into your own whiteness, if you live in a white body, then you are going to do more harm. There is going to be a perpetuation of racialized violence. So again, some of this presentation is going to be an invitation for you to do deeper work. And certainly here is a really timely area in which you can focus on if you want to be a really good trauma-informed system. And then chronic trauma and complex trauma, oftentimes in the mental health community, are used interchangeably. And it's important to be aware of both. Working in school settings, as we're getting information for outside providers. Again, though, when we're thinking about complex trauma, chronic trauma is ongoing over time. Complex specifically has a clear start time early in childhood. And it's often starting with attachment traumas. So those people that we are supposed to rely on the most, those caregivers in our life, when there are disruptions in there or when they are unable or unwilling to provide those caregiving duties to us, that does create some long-term difficulties in many areas in kids and later on adults. So ongoing interpersonal violence or neglect. People who experience early childhood attachment trauma typically have really big concerns and issues with self-worth, feeling like there's not a clear sense of self, so latching on to other people's self, and also thinking about how resilience doesn't form well because there wasn't those supportive adults around. Again, this is something that in reparative relational experiences at school, we can start to provide some healing. That looks like working in ad hoc relationships. So in attachment, it's all about these serve and return responses. And when a baby coos, they're asking you for something. Change their diaper. They want you to babble and play. They want you to read them a book. And every time you meet that need, you return that response. And what you're doing is you're establishing what we call secure attachment. Most of the country has secure attachment based on the last time they did the numbers, which was in 2011. It's really good news for us because despite later on trauma, they have a really good, healthy foundation. Without that healthy foundation, as you experience continued trauma, it makes it a lot harder to form that child's sense of self and to give them the sense that they are safe, especially in your classrooms. And if you don't feel safe walking into a space, you can't learn. So our job, number one, is not to teach the math. It's to make sure that every student that walks in our door feels really safe. Then we can teach the math. But just like we as grown-ups can't access our skills to be really good educators if we're feeling lots of things going on in our brains, kids work exactly the same. Only it's bigger and harder because not all of their brain is neurologically developed yet. So I'm going to just breeze through this. The slides and presentation are available for you. I just wanted to highlight that when we think about students in trauma, 90% of students in setting 4 have reported experiencing trauma. The reported is really important too, because we know trauma is underreported. So if you're a setting 3 teacher and you have students that are really struggling and maybe moving up to that setting 4, those trauma-informed practices might be a really good way to interrupt that turmoil that they're feeling and give them some really amazing adaptations and accommodations in the classroom to keep them in your setting 3 and hopefully eventually down to your setting 2, 1, good to go. That's always the goal. One last note to think about, and we added this specifically when we're thinking about COVID and toxic stress. So when we think about stress, stress is super healthy. It's a normal part of development. Sometimes it's very motivating. I tend to be a procrastinator. I'll hit that snooze alarm, but I know I cannot be late for work. My boss has somebody double check the cameras. Liz, if you're on here, I love you. Double check the cameras to make sure that we are in that door on time. So I have to be on time. And knowing that, that stresses me out a little, but you better believe I am in that door by 7:20 because by 7:30, I have to be on my computer ready to work. So healthy, normal stress. And when we give kids the opportunity to work through healthy, normal stress, we support their development. So once they are 18 and they are grown, as so many of my students like to tell me, they are prepared to be independent. However, when your stress response is on for too long because your environment doesn't feel safe, maybe there's food insecurities, there's pandemics happening, our brain, the thinking part, goes offline because we're in survival mode. Our cortisol levels rise and we start to get used to constantly being stressed. And it's hard. It impacts our digestion, it impacts our sleep, it impacts our ability to regulate time and space and place, which again, things we need to learn. And it gets to this place of toxic stress. And when we have kids coming in our classrooms with toxic stress, they might not have a clearly identified event of trauma, but their alarm system, that stress system, has been on for so long, we have to work with them to get it back under control, or a lot of times I tell my students, we have to put the cap back on the bottle or else it's going to fizz and blow up everywhere. And it comes up behaviorally often. And those behaviors look different. For people, it can be shut down withdrawal. It can be constant, like sensory type behaviors where like they're biting their nails, they're pulling their hair, they're super fidgety. It can look like ADHD, but it is not. It's a trauma or stress response. And also can look like those big explosive behaviors too. So toxic stress, too much stress for too long. If that fits the definition of a student that you're struggling with, again, these approaches might be really appropriate. And I've talked a little bit about this, but when we think about the long-term impacts of trauma, research and science has shown us neurological scans where the brain structure and size typically is smaller than someone who has not experienced trauma, and that also can heal. So while someone is actively experiencing trauma and or they have not yet received treatment or support for the trauma, so it's unresolved, those brain scans are going to show a brain where there are parts, the structures are not towards a typical developmental trajectory. We can get that back online when people start healing. People also tend to have fewer neurological connections, a heightened sense of arousal. I know working in the school setting I do, when people come up behind me and slam the door really loud, big startle response. And that happens during the school year. I'm more stressed out. If that's something that happens to you, that might be a good indication to think about taking care of yourself this summer and ways to get that help and support. But that's definitely a good indicator that maybe some of this complex stress or toxic stress or complex trauma, are happening. Typically, people have a lot of difficulty trusting others. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Dissociative responses are really important to be aware of. Disassociation is normal and healthy to an extent, right? Just like stress. Our brain disassociates when it's overwhelmed. We just take a little mental vacation. I don't know about you all. There are times where I leave work to go home. I don't remember leaving work or how I got home, but I did it, right? I was not there all the way. I was disassociating. Some of you might be disassociating right now. I'm not as funny on the computer as I am in person. So give me some grace. But again, it's a really normal neurological response. However, if because you have really hard things happening all the time, you're constantly disassociating, you can't learn. So you have to get used to being in your body and being grounded. A really simple way of supporting kids if this is happening or you suspect it is start off with some sort of warm-up activity or brain break. Occupational therapists always have a ton of these. Again, if you want to email me, I'm happy to send you some links as well. But start off with calming, because when we're calm and we're grounded, that turns off that dissociative response. Okay, last one to hit on here. This is important for our high school and even some of our later elementary, middle school educators in the room. There is a focus on survival versus future orientation. So if I have grown up with really hard things and my life has been at risk, I don't care about graduating because I'm probably, in my mind, only going to live until I'm 20. So there is no reason for me to have good attendance and meet whatever credit requirement there is to graduate. Until we can support that student in understanding that that foreshortened sense of future is related to their trauma, it's going to be really hard to get that buy-in. And the older they are, the more independent they are, the more of a challenge it is. Because there's this really double-edged sword that you're working with, where a lot of students that experience trauma from a very young age tend to come off as more mature because they're used to caregiving. And in a lot of situations, they've been told that they are because they've been able to survive until this point. Again, though, if we get stuck admiring that behavior, and we should admire it some, it should be an indication, though, that we also have to support them in changing it. Now, that support's not all on us. I really would encourage you to think about what are those co-located services that you have at your schools, as well as your community partners, especially for our older students, so they can keep working through some of that at school and in the community, and hopefully at home. One of the best ways to really have a supportive and effective trauma intervention and PBIS intervention and restorative intervention, whatever that intervention is looking at all the spaces and places we can bulk up that intervention. What we do at school cannot happen in a vacuum or in a silo, or else it doesn't matter. It has to happen at home and in the community as well. So how do we get everybody on board so we can be super successful? Because when we're successful, our students are successful. And that's why we're all here. And this is just an example of some of that underdeveloped brain that I was speaking to earlier. So this is a brain scan that was done. And as you can see on the left-hand side, it's more of a person who's had typical childhood into adolescence into adulthood, not free of stress or adversity, but limited stress and adversity, healthy, manageable. And the person on the other side, their brain on the right-hand side has experienced really significant abuse. So before we jump into this next part, Kelly and I are going to demonstrate a little game for you. I know a lot of you have your cameras off and your mics off. So if you have someone nearby, maybe a school-age child or partner or friend or neighbor, multi-generational family member, whoever's in your house, if you want to grab them, this could be a fun game to play. Kelly and I are going to count to 3. Kelly, do you feel confident about your skill ability to count to 3?
Feeling pretty confident.
Okay, and we're just going to count back and forth. I'll start with 1, you'll do 2, I'll do 3, then you'll start over at 1. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay. 1,
2,
3,
1,
2,
3,
1,
2,
3. We'll pause there. So if you're doing this at home, if you're watching this on the live stream, you can pause here and try that. We're gonna make it a little more challenging now. Kelly, do you know some animals? Have you seen some animals?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I know animals.
You know animals, right. Guys, I know this. Kelly and I've worked together for years. I'm doing this for you. So what we're gonna do now is, Kelly, instead of saying the number 2, could you do an animal noise for me? So we're gonna keep counting to 3, okay?
Okay.
But we're gonna replace 2 with an animal noise. So 1,
moo,
3,
1,
woof,
3,
1,
meow,
3,
1,
bah.
3.
Okay. So if you're joining us again via the live stream later, you can pause here. If you're live with us, if you want to practice that. Kelly, now I know this about you because like I said, we've worked together a long time. Kelly loves to dance, big dancer. That's not true. But what we are gonna do now is we're gonna keep counting to 3. 2 is gonna be a animal noise and 3 is now going to be a dance move. Ready, Kelly?
Okay.
1,
rough,
1,
meow,
I messed it up. Your turn.
1,
woof. All right, so again, if you're joining us on the live stream, you can go ahead and pause that there the YouTube, pause that there, try it out. If you're live with us, you're probably questioning why the heck we just did that. We're going to explain. Kelly, talk me through it. What was hard?
I had to inhibit my impulse to say the number. That was the hardest part for me. And to really pay attention to what you were doing and associating that, I had to use my memory to say, what am I supposed to do now instead of to? And then again, inhibit and then do what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah, so there's lots of these executive functioning skills that are up here on this slide that were being used. And every time we threw something new in, it made it a little harder. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, exactly.
Cool. I'll let you take it over and talk some more about executive functioning.
Okay, so when we're talking about executive functioning skills, we're really talking about the part of the brain, it's called the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex right here behind your forehead, which is why it is essential that you wear a helmet as a side note. But we're really talking about those skills that are necessary to be a good student, to sit in your desk, to focus on the instruction and to learn. And a lot of this has to do with kind of that hidden curriculum of schools too, that a lot of students coming in who have that typical brain that Kara showed us before, they just pick up on this stuff and they get it because their executive function skills are intact and it makes sense to them. But when we're looking at students who are coming in with that history of trauma, there are a lot of deficits, not only like Kara showed us, the neuronal connections are deficient, and then we see it in the classroom. So these are things like the attention, like I had to really focus on what Kara was doing during that activity. I had to inhibit my impulses or any other thoughts that I might be having that would distract me from what we were doing. I had to self-monitor. Am I doing this correctly? I had to be able to plan out what I was going to do and think ahead so that I knew those awesome dance moves that were expected of me coming up. I had to organize my materials, maybe not so much in that example, but in school you have to look at your paper and you have to know where your things are. You have to not only complete your homework, but have it ready when the teacher asks for you to turn it in. So those are what we're talking about with executive functioning skills. And these are significantly deficient in students who have experienced trauma. But when we're talking about resiliency, the silver lining here is that students can increase the connections within their brain in this area. This continues to develop until about age 25 or so. So it's very malleable, and by practicing these skills and providing direct instruction on executive functioning skills, we can really help our students to increase their abilities in these areas. Next. So just really quickly, we talked about the difficulty paying attention, trouble building relationships. We know that students who aren't demonstrating this hidden curriculum, all of these skills, they're kind of ostracized by their peers, and that only continues to compound the impact of their trauma. So now they're being socially excluded from things, and all of this self-esteem and just the learning that happens within those social relationships, they're being held back from. More time out of class due to some of those behaviors and exclusionary practices, like Kara was talking about a little bit earlier, and higher rates of referral to special ed, which we know the stigma that is associated with that. And basically, a lot of the traditional strategies that teachers turn to, that they have in their toolbox, that they learned in their college prep programs, they don't work for these students. Things like holding them in for recess. All that's going to do is compound those effects of social isolation, of them being a problem or not really wanting. It's really just taking away those good things that are present in their lives. So consequences in that way don't work. Another strategy teachers use a lot is calling the family or trying to partner with the family. And that is definitely recommended when we're talking about students with trauma. And in this case, we might not want to only be calling when things are going wrong and expecting the parent to kind of provide consequences at home, because that might not be something that the family has the capacity to do at that time. So we'll get into things that we should do, but really a lot of those traditional strategies don't work. Next. Again, we know that the brain is impaired in those frontal lobes. The amygdala, which is part of the emotional system in the brain, is hyper responsive. So we might see some really big emotional responses to things that we might view as pretty small. Like, oh, that, you know, a peer just said that one thing and we see a big outburst. You might be familiar with size of the problem interventions, things like that. And that's really has to do with those deficient skills in that hyper reactive amygdala and emotional response system that leads to that fight or flight response like Kara was talking about. We see high stress levels, and Kara talked about this as well. And I think as students continue to grow, we see that calm environments can kind of be uncomfortable for them because they're used to those chaotic, high stress environments. So they might do things within a calm classroom to create a little chaos, to create some stimuli, because that helps them to feel more comfortable. Unfortunately, as they grow older, we see this take form of increased risk-taking behaviors to kind of meet that level of stress hormone that they're used to. Of course, physical abuse may result in blows to the head, and we are becoming more and more aware all the time of the significant impact of functioning of concussions and head trauma. And then again, that social engagement being so important, and yet these students being kind of held back from a lot of that. Next. We did that. I just want to take a moment to talk about the impact of this on us. We are all in this work because we care deeply about students and youth and social justice issues. And that does make us a little bit susceptible to things, to feeling the impact of some of what our students are going through. So there's a lot of terms that you've probably heard thrown around. The first one being burnout, and that's really just, you need a break from work. You've been under stress or under pressure for too long. You need to take care of yourself, maybe take a vacation and get away and come back when you're ready and feeling refreshed. When we're talking about vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue, we're really talking about symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that might become present because you are feeling empathy within your relationships with students all the time. So you might be working with several students at the same time who you know are going through really hard things, and you start to just feel like, I can't do this anymore. You might find yourself avoiding specific students, like, I just don't have the energy to do it right now. And when you're feeling that, you really need to take a step back, look at what's happening, support yourself, engage in some of your self-coping strategies, and maybe look into some trauma-related treatment. And then when we're talking about secondary trauma, the difference with that is that it can occur from just hearing about one specific event. So if a student is going through something so traumatic and they share that with you to the point where you yourself are feeling like you experienced that trauma yourself. And when that happens, it is really essential that you look into some trauma-based treatment for yourself, because we cannot support our students if we ourselves are feeling some of these things. Next. And again, this is just to really stress that if we are not feeling, if we're feeling burnt out or traumatized ourselves, we cannot be there, we cannot be present for our students.
So just given time, I'm going to go ahead and pass through these next couple. We've talked about resilience some. If you want to have more conversation, again, my email's at the end. I'm happy to provide additional resources. Quick highlight on this. Oftentimes in trauma trainings, just that kind of overview, the practitioner will talk about the invisible backpack or the invisible briefcase. So, you know, what are those kids bringing into your classroom every day that you can't see? And it's all of those adverse experiences. I want us to rethink it. We can repack that invisible backpack with all of that amazing stuff that we see about them too. And just like they bring the hard stuff from home to school, they can bring those positive experiences from school back home and into the community.
I didn't realize how low we were getting on time, my goodness. So much to say. So PBIS really is a trauma-informed practice. So if you see down here this pyramid, I'm sure you're all familiar with that by now. At Tier 1, we want to provide that safe school where everyone feels welcome, and we're not engaging in re-traumatizing practices. At Tier 2, that might include bringing in the school social worker, school counselor, providing some more frequent supports or check-ins with that student. And then at a Tier 3 for our students who we know have extensive trauma history and are demonstrating a lot of those behavioral and school difficulties I mentioned earlier, we want to be really providing wraparound services to those students and those families, reaching out, setting them up with mental health supports. Next. All of these are Tier 1 strategies at a trauma-informed school. And for time's sake, let's go to the next one, Cara. I just want to take a minute. These are the core domains of a trauma-informed school. And I want to just highlight how in line they are with the key components of PBIS. So supporting staff development, we need that to initiate a new initiative, such as PBIS or trauma-informed schools. But number 2, creating a safe and supportive environment. That is what PBIS is all about, creating that welcoming space for families and community members, and most importantly, students, by recognizing the positive, explicitly teaching our positively stated expectations. Assessing needs and providing services. In PBIS terms, we call that screening and database decision-making, talking about the same thing. Building skills, that's our continuum of evidence-based interventions in the PBIS world. Collaborating with students and families is essential, especially when we look at cultural considerations and understanding the intergenerational trauma like Cara was talking about, and how we can provide spaces and interventions to support that. And then adapting policies and procedures to make sure that they're not further stigmatizing any particular group, and that they're not re-traumatizing students. Next. So these are some of the areas where staff can receive training to really help ensure that we are providing that trauma-informed environment. And just want to highlight again those restorative practices and the importance of that in teaching skills through that restorative and avoiding that exclusionary practice that further traumatizes students. Next. We'll skip that for now. And the next slide that Car's going to bring up here is looking at some of the things that happen in all schools that can really be re-traumatizing students. So you have that list there. When you know that you're working with a student who has a history of trauma, looking at these situations and talking with the student and the family about what might be triggering in these areas. But these are very common practices and very commonly triggers for students. Next. I know we're out of time. I want to talk about predictable responses really quick. So something we've done in our building is provided in writing to all people within the building a set of predictable responses, which states when a student engages in blank problematic behavior, this is how the staff will respond. And we work really hard as a staff to ensure that we are consistent with this. Because when students know that we will respond with steps A, B, and C, it takes the anxiety out of what will happen if I do this, and that limit testing that students who have experienced trauma need to do in order to ensure their sense of safety. So for example, I can know in my setting that if I act this way, you will respond in a safe way and in a supportive way and will not re-traumatize me. So they are very important and have led to a lot of success within our program, and our students know them forward and backward because they mean a lot to them.
As Kelly said, we are up on time. If people don't mind hanging out for just another couple of minutes, we do want to talk really quick too about combating white supremacy and also dealing with COVID-19 as additional considerations for trauma-informed care as we move into next school year. Oh, I'm gonna have to skip through one of my favorite scholars talking. Sorry. But all of these slides are available. Kelly and I are very good at being bad presenters in that we put a lot of information on slides. So a lot of the pieces that we're not able to get to today are there for you. But if you don't mind just hanging out a couple more minutes, Kelly's going to talk about COVID and
yeah, with COVID-19, obviously we are all very aware of what's going on with it. A lot of researchers are talking about the experience of COVID as an ACE in and of itself. So when we think about that, now everyone has an ACE coming into our programs. It's very recent and fresh and will still be a concern when we come back. And then when we think about those compounding factors for our students who maybe already had 1 or 2 or 3 ACEs and now they have this put on top of it. So it's going to be really impactful in all of those school outcomes that we talked about, really taking time at the beginning of the school year to develop those relationships and providing instruction, not only on what you're doing to keep the building and the students physically safe, but also acknowledging the anxiety that students might be feeling, that you yourself are feeling, is really important to just take the time at the beginning of the school year. The math and reading can wait because they won't be able to focus on it anyway if they are not feeling safe. So that is our first step when we welcome students back in the fall, hopefully. If we remain on distance learning, of course, all of the strategies we've used to really focus on maintaining those relationships. Taking care of ourselves is absolutely essential. to our leaders out there, checking in with staff about how they feel and what their concerns are about coming back. And then just a note, the numbers are still coming in and we don't have anything solid, but there is some early suggestions that domestic violence and substance abuse have increased during this time due to the stress of the quarantine and all of the things that go along with that, including financial stress and just families being quarantined together for a long period of time. So
we're just going to finish talking a little bit about racialized violence, specifically in the form of white supremacy and how that impacts specifically our Black and African American students. Given really what's happening in our culture at this time, we need to be really in tune with this. And if you are a white educator, you are not allowed not to talk about this. I know you're like, who's this lady? Why is she telling me what to do? But really, silence is insidious. What happens when we are silent is that narratives, and in this case, narratives of historic and intergenerational trauma, compile, and all you are going to do is break down any relationship you have had with your students. So if you want to be a trauma-informed educator, you have to head on tackle this, and you got to talk about it, and you got to be genuine and authentic, and you have to do your homework beforehand. Sorry, I'm on a soapbox a little. So I got this information from Chicago Public Schools. I took it word for word and I put in a couple of resources at the bottom. I thought it was phenomenal. This is what I am bringing to our district equity team and our district school social workers as we move back into next school year. These are just 4 key points on what we need to do to make our schools safe for our Black and African American students. And if we start to really tear down white supremacy, that makes it safer for our other brown students, our Native students, our Hispanic and Latinx students. It makes it safer for women. So in tackling this paradigm, what we are doing is we are being trauma informed for all. And we're starting with a matter that is happening all around us right now. So if you need additional resources or reading, again, this work has to start with you for all of the trauma-informed work. But if you are committed to this and this is the trajectory that you see yourself going on as an educator and you want resources, by all means, please reach out to Kelly or I. Thank you all so much for your time this afternoon. This is always how I love to end presentations. Kids do well if they can, and adults are caring and compassionate when they take care of themselves. So please reach out to us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Kelly and Kara, if you just hang on for a few minutes, we're gonna do some closing thoughts. And you did have one item in the chat. Would you be willing to share the behavior response matrix you use or a few examples? We would love to get our staff on the same page. So if that's, and Kelly, did you put your email in the chat? And it's on there, and it's on their last slide there. So feel free to reach out to them. That was really wonderful and very timely information for us. Thank you both so much. Now, like we talked about earlier, if you guys just want to hang on for a couple of minutes, we're going to do our closing remarks now, so we don't have to meet again. First of all, the PBIS leadership team would just like to give a big shout out to all the presenters yesterday and today. It's so helpful to learn from these Minnesota examples. And I encourage all the participants, we thank you all for joining us, to think about presenting next year and applying for an exemplar school. One of the things I noticed as we went through this, talking to some of the schools who were presenting, they in themselves didn't apply to be exemplar schools. We're hoping that changes next year. I know I'll be working with Kelly and Kara to make sure they fill out an application like we talked about. And I hope the participants were able to see a wide range of how effective PBIS implementation can be to lead to improved results, and that PBIS framework can be helpful in addressing issues related to equity, as well as these uncertain times and our transitions. We don't know what the fall is going to look like, but many of the presenters helped talk about that today. And we'd like to especially thank the planning committee who helped transition this to a web-based delivery. It was really a team effort, ongoing, and so we thank the regional projects, our trainers, and our coaches. And please consider sharing your implementation successes and challenges with us, including topics for next year. And please fill out the evaluation. We would love to get your feedback. Good luck with the transition back to the school in the fall. And thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for who participated. I think that's it. Any other thoughts? Feel free to unmute. Otherwise, I think we're done.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.